Welcome to National Security Law Today, the podcast of the Standing Committee on Law and National Security. I'm Elisa, always here in my individual capacity. So the United States has been engaged in a bombing campaign against Iran for more than 4 months now. And this past week, President Trump signed what has been styled as a 14-point memorandum of understanding with Iran. This is as distinct from an agreement or a peace deal. However, there's still questions about how it compares to the previous deal by President Obama, the JCPOA, or the Joint Plan of Action. There are also numerous questions about whether an MOU has any force and whether it bypasses Congress. So I thought we'd talk to Brian Egan, the former State Department legal advisor, counsel for the U.S. Department of Treasury, and former Deputy White House counsel, and more. He's now a partner at the law firm of Skadden, which means, yay, he can talk to us. He's also a member of the Standing Committee on Law and National Security, and most importantly, he gets international agreements. So, Brian, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Who are the parties to the current agreement?
Just to start, I would not call this an agreement, putting on my State Department hat. This is, as you said, Elisa, this is a memorandum of understanding, legally non-binding as a matter of international law, just like the JCPOA was, by the way. So both were non-binding instruments, and State Department parlance saves the word agreement for legally binding treaties and other documents. The parties, so to actually answer your question, are Iran and the United States.
Okay, let's talk though for a second, but what countries were parties to the JCPOA, even if it wasn't an agreement? And thank you for refining that, because I think it's important to be fair and honest about what's happening here. And I've heard a number of people characterize the MOU as somehow different from JCPOA because JCPOA in their imagination had some sort of force of law. But who was involved in the JCPOA? Was it just a bilateral thing?
It was not. The JCPOA had a number of additional parties. So in addition to the United States and to Iran, the so-called P5+1 group of world powers were parties. So the P5 are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom, in addition to the United States. Germany was also a party. The European Union was not a party per se, but it participated very closely in the negotiations of the JCPOA. So it was a much broader umbrella of countries who negotiated and signed or adhered to the JCPOA.
Unfortunately, this was signed at Versailles, and there have been a lot of references to sort of the end of World War I and the carving up of Germany that almost foretold World War II and sort of the poverty experienced and some of the things that contributed to what we now call radicalization inside Germany. That's also the place of the meeting, correct?
Yeah, so the JCPOA was signed in Vienna, Austria, and actually most of the negotiations took place in Vienna. Just as Versailles, you said, at least was symbolically important because of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I and maybe led to World War II. Vienna, I think, was symbolically important because of the number of international organizations that are actually headquartered in Vienna, including the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, which is right there in Vienna. So for about 2 years, negotiators from all of the countries, particularly Iran and the United States, were basically almost permanently stationed in Vienna trying to negotiate the JCPOA.
Okay, and the geopolitical events leading to this, I don't think were entirely clear to me, except that it seemed that there was some sort of conversation that happened between President Trump and perhaps Netanyahu. And then, there had been the October 6th terrorist attacks, which were uniquely provocative and carried out by an organization obviously funded by Iran, maybe not all of their funding from Iran, but another occasional and convenient proxy. So I guess, how was JCPOA different? What informed the decision to do it at the time?
So in some ways, the JCPOA was really years in the making, really going back to the George W. Bush administration, where Iran had basically violated an agreement it had made on nuclear safeguards around developing enriched uranium for a military program, nuclear weapons. The IAEA condemned Iran for doing this in 2006, and really the international community It's remarkable to think only 20 years ago was unanimous in condemning Iran. There were a series of UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions on Iran beginning in 2006, which all of the key members, the US, Russia, China, all agreed to. And there was a consensus that an agreement had to be reached with Iran to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons. That led to a lengthy series of negotiations where essentially the trade was sanctions relief of some sort in exchange for commitments from Iran, first of all, not to develop nuclear weapons, but also to halt some of its uranium enrichment, to halt the production of some of the centrifuges that can lead to the development of enriched uranium in exchange for phased sanctions relief. So 2006 is when the IAEA condemned Iran, and all of these steps happened between 2006 and 2015. And when you compare it, as you said, Elisa, to what happened over the last 4 months, which is really the time frame that led to the current deal, the MOU, it's just kind of a much different playing field.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but I wonder what the situation was with how Iranian proxies were acting at the time versus what we're looking at right now, which is, a country with a nuclear buildup, funding Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and really kind of a lot of external operations. And we don't need to harken back to something that happened like in the early 1990s, but I mean, more recently, they've sort of acted in their own security interests, in my view, to sort of compromise other countries that maybe they want to buffer against this or that, perhaps Israel. But it did seem that it was metastasizing. Was there anything of the kind going on back when the negotiations were happening, understanding it was over like a decade?
Well, just that in the time when I was in government and most directly involved in the 2012 to 15 period, I think there were. Iran was supporting the Houthis at that point in Yemen. There was active conflict going on in Yemen. Certainly in Lebanon, Iran's support for Hezbollah was continuing at that point. I think that the negotiators on the non-Iranian side of the JCPOA kind of made a conscious decision to focus only on the nuclear issue, not to focus on terrorism, not to focus on Iran's support for proxies and destabilizing the Gulf. That was frankly one of the big criticisms of the JCPOA by some in the United States, is that it didn't go far enough to address the other concerns. But I think the hope was that by focusing on the one, let's call it the biggest issue, nuclear enrichment, nuclear weapons, you could lead to economic progress that could then lead to talks on the other issues. I think the MOU here tries to do a little bit more than just nuclear by addressing, and we can get into the details, an end to all conflicts. Now, what exactly that means, it's not really clear, but at least there's an argument. It also applies to Iran's, proxies and support for them.
It's helpful to hear you say that because I see this as a very complicated multilateral situation where we tend to believe that Iran wants sanctions relief and that can be brought to its knees or to the negotiating table. Alternatively, if the carrot is sanctions relief, and I think a lot of people, perhaps people in the administration at this point, feel that that hasn't worked, that they are impervious to that kind of intervention. They want sanctions relief in order to dig in. And also that, and maybe you encountered this, it's been publicly reported that there is internal conflict between actors in the IRGC, which functions as, I guess, what their intelligence and military apparatus, and those in the government doing negotiations, such that there was even sabotage at times of the agreement by these extremist forces. And it just strikes me that this is so acutely complicated that focusing on the one issue, I don't know, I guess, was that the only way, probably the only way to get them to do anything?
In the West, we tend to think of Iran kind of as a monolith in some ways, that the government is just moving forward in a single direction. And in fact, they actually have a lot of democratic tendencies. And like our government, there's lots of different forces at play. The foreign ministry doesn't think the same way as the IRGC, which doesn't think of the same way as the supreme leader, which doesn't think the same way as the Iranian parliament. So you've got a lot of different actors with a lot of different views on whether they should be entering into an agreement with the United States. I think earlier today, you even saw the foreign ministry and the IRGC coming out in different ways on whether the Strait of Hormuz was open, whether IAEA would be part of a new deal. So it is kind of fascinating to watch. And that was definitely going on during the JCPOA as well, that you had some in the IRGC, as you said, Elisa, really wanted to do things that seemed to sabotage the possibility of an agreement.
Let's talk about the MOU there. And I think it might be interesting to run through a few points. Some of them we're going to consolidate for purposes of time. But you mentioned already point one, which would, I assume, because of its placement within the MOU, is intended to signal its importance to the agreement, which is the end to conflict. And I believe the quoted language that I have seen is on all fronts. You mentioned there's no sort of definitional language here, but I assume a reasonable person would say all fronts includes Hezbollah, all fronts includes Hamas, all fronts includes Houthis. What are your thoughts? As a guy who's dealt with this stuff, much more superior to my sort of understanding of how we handle this.
Yeah, but that's how I read it too. I mean, it says all fronts, including in Lebanon, which I think is a key triggering phrase, frankly, on both sides. Another party who's not party to this MOU, but is a very important player, is Israel. And Israel has its own interests, of course, in defending itself from incursions from Lebanon and the Hezbollah. Israel's also encamped and has established a security zone in Lebanon. And so is the United States' commitment to end conflict on all fronts, including in Lebanon, a commitment in part to bring the U.S. ally Israel into the fray here. And as you said, on the Iranian side, to stop its proxy Hezbollah from engaging in hostilities. I think it has to be part of it, but it's even though the verbiage is not totally clear.
And then point two, it said respect for internal affairs. I didn't chuckle when I read this because I thought about Iranian foreign malign influence campaigns on social media, which would be an effort, arguably, to interfere with internal affairs. I assume this was intended to address their concern that the United States seeks regime change. How should we interpret this?
I think this is just a reference to the UN Charter, which talks about territorial integrity and sovereignty and respecting one another's internal affairs. It's generic language for one country respecting the borders and internal workings of another country. So it's ambiguity that allows you to reach an agreement without necessarily coming to grips with what the words mean on the page.
All right. Point four is that the U.S. is to end the blockade. Now, depending upon what news source you read, they've mined the Straits of Hormuz. What blockade precisely? Whose blockade?
This is good. The ordering gave me a little chuckle here too, right? Like, yeah, who's blocking whom? I think the U.S. was, at some point, the U.S., they were blocking ships that Iran had authorized to depart Iran, to enter Iran, primarily oil, but not only oil. So the U.S. Navy was implementing a blockade against Iranian ships. Now, Iran had effectively created a blockade against the world's ships through mining and other things. So I think this is the U.S. saying we're not going to stop ships entering and exiting Iran.
Okay, because it seems to me that before this whole bombing thing, that Iran didn't realize they could, turn the Straits of Hormuz into like a Panama Canal and charge fees and maybe make as much money off of that as they do off of oil. And it also said that Iran will make arrangements, this is a quote, make arrangements using its best efforts.
This is not just treaties. This is like how lawyers work through what they're going to do in a contract, like you said, right? Best efforts is like, we can't quite promise this, but we're going to try. And this is like a double down on we're going to try, make arrangements using its best efforts. I think, though, what this is saying, and this was language that was added to the final agreement, by the way, it wasn't in the leaked draft from earlier in the negotiations. I think this is Iran saying, look, we can't 100% guarantee safe passage because of all the mines we've laid, because of all the military stuff we've put in the strait, because there's a lot of language in this point 5 on demining, on removal of military objects by Iran. So I suspect this is caveated language that Iran added because of some of the limitations in what they can do.
Right. Maybe they don't remember where they put all those mines. We were kind of panicked. Don't know where they are now. Okay. Point 6. Now, this is what I really wanted to talk to you about. This gives Iran money for reconstruction. Now, I just want to say we had a Marshall Plan. At some point we rebuilt Germany, and they're not the same thing, but isn't this kind of always where we end up with Iran? Isn't this history repeating itself? They're like hostages, we'll let them go. Just give us our money.
Mm-hmm. As I understand it and read this is $300 billion of money that's not Iran's right now. This is investments that third parties will make in Iran under a, quote, definitive mutually agreed plan for reconstruction and economic development. Now, nobody knows who's making this investment. President Trump has said this isn't going to be U.S. taxpayer money. The vice president has said there's desire in the Arab world and from private investors to invest in Iran, but there's been no sources named for this $300 billion in investment. I think this is one of the bigger mysteries of this whole thing as well. What does the U.S. in particular have in mind here? Have they consulted with any allies who are supposedly the source for this new investment funding? Or is any investor in the right mind going to agree to this without a lot of ironclad commitments that they won't be sanctioned for re-entering Iran? So hard to see this happening, in my view. It would be a remarkable accomplishment if it does.
Point 7 shocked me, but maybe because I do not have the experience that you do, but all U.S. and UN sanctions, we're binding the UN against Iran will end. Can we obligate the UN to do this? And correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't there people in Congress who got a little ticked off about the JCPOA and tried to sort of take legislative action to mitigate its impact?
Yeah, this is the one actually that shocked me the most. And I think you've got to read the kind of lawyerly caveats. We're going to undertake to terminate, so we're not promising to terminate. And you're right, Elisa, the U.S. government doesn't have the authority, the executive branch, to do all of this on its own. The UN has to agree to unwind UN sanctions. That's going to take a vote of at least the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. All have to agree. On the U.S. domestic side, there are statutes in place that require congressional sign-off, essentially, if the U.S. is going to terminate a number of the sanctions that are U.S.-only sanctions in place. And this was an area that was very sensitive under the JCPOA, where the Republicans said, over our dead body for some of this stuff. So I think there's a lot of work that would have to be done, even with a Republican president and a Republican Congress, for now at least, to convince the U.S. Congress to go along with a plan to remove all sanctions. The last thing I'll say is the JCPOA only promised to remove nuclear sanctions. And some saw this as kind of a sleight of hand because, of course, in addition to nuclear sanctions, you've got terrorism sanctions, you've got narcotics sanctions, you've got all sorts of other sanctions on Iran from the United States. When you only unpeel one layer of the onion, it doesn't really do a lot of good if you're Iran trying to kind of get beyond sanctions. And I think that was their experience, even when the JCPOA was in effect, is, wow, this is actually pretty limited relief. So I think Iran was no doubt pushing for a removal of all sanctions as an important step that goes well beyond what the JCPOA promised.
The other thing is, take for a minute, I don't know if any of the Republicans who sponsored or even voted on that legislation and had strong feelings, and they did. And I vaguely remember at the time, there were people who were unhappy, who were not Republicans, who thought that it was a bad idea to bring any relief to Iran, that it wasn't merited. I don't know if any of those people are still around in Congress, and I wonder what their reaction is going to be. Putting aside any argument about whether or not Congress, an Article 1 body, had any authority to deal with this legislatively when, arguably in another context, we've certainly argued this is something within the province of an Article 2 authority and the president's executive authority. But moving on, point 8 seems important to me in that it says, at least for now, that Iran will give up its nuclear weapons and enrichment program. Now, I will only tell you that we had a former inspector from IAEA on who, and for some reason, right before the bombing, he wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal suggesting that we make plans for how to acquire this nuclear material. He knew where it was, and he thought, unfortunately, we would have to work with Russia a bit because they built the one nuclear power plant we know exists in Iran. But he also said something that I have to say surprised me, which is he didn't think they had actually built nuclear weapons because he just didn't think they could get it together. So I wonder, kind of, that's a lot of questions just
Yeah.
buried in one, but what was your reaction to this? And what did you think about this point 8?
So Iran pledging not to develop a nuclear weapon, that's nothing new. That's even in the darkest days, they were saying they were not going to develop a nuclear weapon. So that's table stakes, I think. The stuff about enriching uranium is the most important and interesting piece to me. And this is the area where this was the topic of the JCPOA. The JCPOA was criticized by some in the non-proliferation community, some members of Congress, for not going far enough in this area, where the JCPOA actually permitted Iran to continue some enrichment and sunsetted some of the restrictions on enrichment after some period of time. And so what this seems to do, and I say seems because there's nothing that's agreed to yet. This basically mentions a plan that will be negotiated. But I think the plan to be negotiated would take enriched uranium out of Iran and have Iran get its supply elsewhere. The enriched uranium that they need for their own civilian nuclear capacity would not be done in Iran. That's certainly what the U.S. has in mind, based on all reports. Not clear whether Iran will agree to that eventually, but this is, in my mind, the most interesting advancement potentially beyond where the JCPOA landed.
I'd like to go back for a second because I think history can be instructive. One of the issues in dealing with a government like Iran is the history that goes back thousands of years, literally. And we are a country celebrating our 250th birthday. And one of the things that happened previously when they took hostages in the embassy, the whole Argo story, was that there were negotiations, these Algiers Accords, which I believe started with President Carter, if I'm recalling correctly. What role did they play in the release of the U.S. embassy personnel? And what is the significance of that dynamic? Is there a lesson to take from, even though we're talking 50 years ago, but again, it's an old country with a long memory. Sometimes I think we move fast and we forget that they harbor these things. What do you think?
Yeah, it's fascinating. For as much as Iran and the United States have basically been adversaries for the last 50 years, there's been so many negotiations between the two parties, beginning with the Algiers Accords, where, you had a period of time in the 70s where Iran and the U.S. were one of their biggest trading partners of each other. Iran bought more weapons from the United States than anybody else in the 1970s. There was a hostage incident in the late 70s, and all of this trade ground to a halt. Both parties seized each other's assets, billions and billions of dollars on each side. And there were all these claims from one side to the other, government to private parties, that were just kind of in limbo while the hostage situation played out. What the Algiers Accords did was created a kind of a litigation process that is still going on today, where Iranians can adjudicate claims against the United States, American companies adjudicate claims against Iran, all dating to this 1970 period in an arbitral tribunal in the Netherlands. So that was the first negotiation between these two adversaries. It involved frozen assets, as much as many things do today. And it created a framework that actually, as clunky as it was, actually worked, in that there is this tribunal. Claims have been adjudicated. Money has changed hands. You'll remember the pallets of money that were shipped from the U.S. to Iran, famously or infamously as part of the JCPOA. Those were funds that were due to Iran pursuant to a claim that had been filed under these Algiers Accords. So in some ways, there are lots of connections. I agree with you.
What would the lawyers be doing in this? And I know we've had this conversation before, but I think it merits repeating here. First of all, for any young lawyer listening, do you really want to deal with a mess like this? I know somebody's like, yeah, it sounds great. How do lawyers get involved, and how do they sometimes maybe get pushed to the side?
That's a great question. Great way to think about it, too. And I think it's a fascinating issue. If you're an international lawyer, somebody interested in international law, these are the issues that, get you excited, I think. So lawyers are involved. Some administrations more than others. I'd say less so in this administration, more so in the ones that I was in. But you can't have an international agreement with terms that everybody agrees to without having lawyers who understand the kind of letter of international law on your side to make sure you're agreeing as a country to the thing that you think you're agreeing to, and the other side is agreeing to what you think they're agreeing to. If this is a success, which I think we would all hope it is in some way, there are going to be many other agreements and sub-agreements and protocols and you name it, technical amendments around the nuclear issues, technical amendments around sanctions. All of those things have a legal component to them that you need lawyers to help make sure you get right. Lawyers are not the only people in the room. They're not necessarily driving the policy discussions, but if things are going well, in my view, you want a lawyer kind of at your right or left side who can help you make sure that the words on paper meet the meaning of the minds.
You mentioned something that one of the calls, is for sanctions relief, and there's a process for sanctions. If you're sitting over in the Palace of Versailles and you're negotiating a deal on behalf of the United States and there's an OFAC sanctions packet that has to be dealt with, what the heck happens there? Because, that is process laden. So what does that look like? Are they calling back over to Treasury and saying, hey, why don't we do this? Would you guys be cool with what does that look like? How does that play out?
Yeah, I think there are calls going on between Treasury, State Department, negotiators. I don't know how frequent those calls are. And I don't know if the calls are like you said, hey, is this okay, Treasury, versus, hey, Treasury, you need to do this. That's always the, push and pull of how these things go. But even if you don't want the agencies involved, let's say you're an administration, you just want to do it all from the top. You don't want the agencies involved. Well, guess what? The agencies have to be involved. There are many, many regulations. There are many companies who are potentially subject to civil and criminal penalties, depending on what these regulators do. You need to understand how these sanctions work if you want to pull them back in kind of an orderly fashion. So absolutely, there will have to be calls between the negotiators, the people in the NSC or the White House, the State Department and the Treasury Department and the Justice Department, I would say, to make sure that any sanctions relief kind of makes sense and matches what the negotiators have in mind without going too far or not far enough.
So I imagine there are times and there are presidents, and it's not just this one, let's be frank, who say, here's what we're going to do, regardless of process. And the lawyer's job is, we're going to do this, and it's going to make a mess back home. It's going to make a mess at the State Department. It's going to make a mess at Treasury. DOJ is going to be, sweating from their noses. You're just going to have to clean it up and deal with it, right? Sometimes there's a reason in history, a moment that has to be, it's a carpe diem. You got to seize that moment, that day, to make something work for the benefit of not just the United States. What happens then?
Yeah, that's, I think, where a lawyer can be most beneficial is, no, we got to get this done, as you say. We've got to negotiate this. We've got to negotiate it in 3 days. And, we're going to break some glass, and that's okay. We want to minimize the damage. That's where you can have lawyers who, first of all, understand the legal and regulatory framework that you are probably trying to change. Need a lawyer to help you do that, to do the least amount of damage. And frankly, lawyers can talk to each other in ways, including between the agencies, it's hard for policy people to do sometimes. And so I think a lawyer in the constructive sense can really help achieve a result much faster than it might otherwise be possible for a government as complicated as ours. In a non-constructive sense, a lawyer can be the impediment to progress too, and be saying, no, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And finding your way through real impediments that can be overcome, I think, is often jobs of lawyers in places like the White House to help presidents achieve their policy objective consistent with law.
And, I think for very young lawyers or even law students, the thing that they're told over and over again is how important it is to spot issues. And boy, is this about issue spotting.
Seriously. Yeah, chock full of issues here.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming in tonight, Brian. We'll watch these events closely and we'll hope for the best and that something can be done. I know I've been in Europe a couple times over the last few months, and there is tremendous anxiety over the energy costs there, since European countries do not tend to be as energy self-sufficient as we are. So not just for us, but for, all of our allies. I hope something can be worked out.
Me too. Thank you again for having me.
All right. And thank you for listening to NSLT. Remember to subscribe to NSLT on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon, whatever you like to listen to. Remember to like and share this episode with a friend. Hopefully you value civil discussion and facts over clickbait and shouting. We try to avoid sort of political discussions and stick to the facts and the law. It seems to work better for us, and we hope you appreciate that. If you do have a fondness for this podcast, we ask you to go ahead and rate it. Give us a 5-star rating on your listening app of choice. The writer, producer, and host of NSLT is me, Elisa Poteet. I'm always here in my individual capacity. Our editor, my co-producer, is Francis Burkham. I am always accompanied by the never stops, never runs out of energy, Holly McMahon, who's also the co-producer of this cast. Our program manager is the ever lovely, wonderful, hardworking Antasia Hawkins Blakeney. Social media and research support comes from Alana Coopersmith. And of course, we get so much help from the brilliant minds of the members of the Standing Committee on Law and National Security who pursue the good in the interest of national security without regard for politics. And you should do the same. We'll see you next time.
The views expressed on national security law today have not been approved by the House of Delegates or the Board of Governors of the American Bar Association, and this recording should not be construed as representing ABA policy.